Well, I'm glad to be here. I've been here for 3 or 4 days, and before that I was in Madrid, Malaga, Zaragoza, and Barcelona. I've been away from home, which is in the Great Lakes of North America, for 2 weeks, and I return tomorrow. I want to be receptive to the political changes occurring in Europe, and to the struggle for a life independent of the state and the market in the current crisis. I'm a professional historian. I've got a good job. I feel privileged to have it. Leaving Detroit for Madrid last Sunday on the 5th of May. This is what I wrote down when I woke up this morning. My thoughts were with the epitome of enclosure, the prison. In particular, I was thinking of the H blocks in Ireland, because it was the anniversary of the death of Bobby Sands, whose hunger strike against the criminalization of his politics for a united and Republican Ireland had aroused the ire, personal ire, I think, of Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister for the UK. Her government sought the destruction of the dignity of her prisoners, isolating them in individual cells without glazing on the window, subject to deliberate cruelty by the prison authorities. Yet these political prisoners were able to study the history and language of their country together, to communicate with one another by a complex percussive system on the walls, to obtain writings from outside upon cigarette papers in minuscule handwriting, and finally to attract the attention of the world. So I had a good flight from Detroit to Madrid. We historians, we find small stories and tell them, and also we try to tell big stories. So I would like to tell a few small stories, express my ambitions personally as a craftsperson in history, and then with your help today begin to imagine a bigger story, a big story. As for a small story, I wanted to begin with Catherine Despard, the African-American woman of color, wife and comrade to Edward Marcus Despard, the Irish renegade from the British Army, who was executed on the 23rd of February, 1803. She found an ingenious way of smuggling messages to him in the newly opened Coldbath Fields prison. She went to the quill maker, boiled out the insides of the quill, set them to dry before rolling up messages and inserting them in the hollow quill. She roasted a piece of meat, but not well done, and then inserted the quill close to the bone, where the heat would not destroy the writing. This is a story Francis Place tells. She then conveyed the meal across the rectilinear grid of streets of the recently laid out squares of the West End of London into the maze of smaller streets of London's Clerkenwell, where this prison had been opened 4 years earlier, in 1794. Her persistent agitation on behalf of Edward, who was locked up without charge during another suspension of habeas corpus, her letters to the Home Secretary, to the Chief Magistrate of London, to its sheriff, and to the head of the operation that will become MI5, her work with the other political prisoners, including Mrs. Evans, the wife of the last secretary of the London Corresponding Society, her letters to the press, her lobbying of members of Parliament, especially Sir Francis Burdett. All these efforts had succeeded in getting her some rights of visitation and the removal of her fevered husband to a cell with glazing on the window and a small fire to warm him against the winter snows. This Coldbath Fields prison, I said, was opened in 1794. It was an enclosure of the modern type, designed to isolate prisoners from one another, to prevent communications with others, forcing a brutal regime of silence and incessant labor in the name of sanitation and reform. Coldbath Fields was called the Steel, a truncation of the word Bastille. And that's as far as I got in my writing this morning. I wanted to tell you that Jules Michelet counted 30 new prisons in Paris at the end of the 18th century. I wanted to tell you that 42 prisons were built before the Coldbath Fields prison was erected. I wanted to remind you that the Bastille's walls were 30 feet thick and 100 feet high. I learned that its garden had been enclosed a few years earlier, and the few prisoners there denied even a time to walk. The storming of the Bastille was one of those revolutionary events which changed the subjectivities of people. I wanted to quote from the English essayist William Hazlitt: "Let all the victims that have perished under the Ancien Regime in dungeons, in an agony and without trial, without an accusation, without witnesses, be assembled together, and their chains struck off, and the shout of jubilee and exaltation they would make, or that nature would make at the sight, will be the shout that was heard when the Bastille fell." The concept of jubilee has powerful meaning for Americans because it was the term of the slaves during the American Civil War, whose only permissible book was the Old and New Testaments, and it was in chapter 25 of Leviticus, where the 7-year Jubilee was declared for the cancellation of debts, the return of land, its disprivatization, cancellation of debts, the manumission or freedom of slaves, the land made fallow for a year of rest. This was the sign not only of the American Civil War, but also of the anti-enclosure movement in the UK. It's a powerful concept for those brought up in a biblical tradition, and it's done its work in our time among the liberation theologians of Central and South America, not to mention other parts of the world. But so I wanted to link the fall of the Bastille to Jubilee. I wanted to remind you that the creation of the dream of an independent Irish Republic, the work of the United Irish in October 1791, came only 2 or 3 months after the cry on that thunderous night in the North Plain of Haiti in August of 1791 that led to the destruction of the white planters and the liberation of Haiti as the second republic and the first successful slave revolt in human history, its independence in the year that Despard was to be executed in 1803. For Thomas Paine also, the downfall of the Bastille was a downfall of despotism that combined in this Protestant tradition the doubting castle and the giant despair that you find in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. The creation of these prisons must be seen also in terms of other enclosures of the 1790s, a period of tremendous and intensive war and transformation and privatization of a manifold of human commons. I refer first, after the prison, to the streets themselves, now for traffic on the right hand or the left hand, no longer for social interaction. I want to refer to the factory walls created for steam-powered replacement of the work of handicraft, the transformations of human labor under this sign of so-called improvement, a term invented by Arthur Young of the Board of Agriculture that began to enclose and privatize the land of the UK behind hedges, ditches, walls, fences, not yet barbed wire, razor wire. Despard spent the 1790s in British prisons, King's Bench, Newgate, Coldbath Fields, the Tower, Horsemonger Lane Jail. The older, corrupt prison, like Newgate, was a center of liberation, filled in the summer of 1793 with feminists, millenarians, vegetarians, antinomians, prophets, poets, philosophers, historians, healers, and doctors, all enemies of the state, and all able to communicate with one another in an encuentro. This was the possibility in the prison, but I should pause here for a moment. As a historian, I am frequently criticized for being a romantic, and I confess it. What I have said just now about Newgate is true. Such people could communicate. Those communications were not frequent. They were not at ease as we are here on Mount Joyce Square in the comfort, hospitality of the DIT. Thank you, Noel. And to Grad Cam. But it was possible. And that possibility is what inspired a quartet of enclosers, including Jeremy Bentham, whose notion of a panopticon, of an all-seeing, all-knowing, total control of the prison, of a regime of silence, of creating a mill to grind prisoners in and to make the idle industrious, to use his phrase. The panopticon was rejected by the British authorities in Dublin in 1792. The National Assembly of France would not even take a second look at it. But this became his haunted house. And it's his figure of the panopticon that we see now as an integral to the project of neoliberalism. USA number one. USA is the first of all countries in its proportion of its population in prison and in the absolute number of prisons. This is the growth industry of neoliberalism. Lord George Gordon divided his substance with those who had no money in prison in Newgate. He clothed the naked and fed the hungry, to coin a phrase. They were composed of all ranks, the Jew and the Gentile, the legislator and the laboring mechanic, the officer and soldier, all shared alike. Liberty and equality were enjoyed in their full extent. This said his biographer, Watson, who wrote 2 years after he died in 1796 about conditions in Newgate. It's these conditions that the Benthamite Project sought to change, so that the prison could no longer be an encuentro of the meeting of the manifold of commoners. I refer to the manifold of commoners. And by this, I'm referring to the mutineers on the ships of 1797 when the British Navy mutinied. 33 were incarcerated in Coldbath Fields. Richard Parker, the president of the Red Republic of the Maritime Fleet, was hanged, of course, as were 40 others. But many were imprisoned in this Coldbath Fields prison. Inside that quill, which was inside the roast beef, which was inside the basket, which was inside the meal that was brought to the inside of the prison, were writings. I like to think they were writings of Thomas Spence, the greatest commoner of London at the time, whose method of expression included making his own money as tokens with signs and revolutionary slogans, whose method of communication was chalking the pavement, who created songs that were sung in the streets, jubilee songs, songs against landlords, songs of equality, songs of feminism. Thomas Spence did not share a cell with Edward Fitzgerald, but was present in the prison while he was there. The authorities knew of these possibilities and sent them both off to Shrewsbury Prison, also a new prison under the Benthamite scheme of enclosure. These are enclosures of the mind, I submit, as well as enclosures of the body. Spence was this commoner, did I not say? He was learning from the North American commons. He was learning from the South American commons. As indeed Despard had in Belize of the Mayan people, or British Honduras as it was then. But the European imagination had already been excited to the notion of commons, to another regime besides that of the commodity, by, of all people, the Jesuits among the Guarani people, you remember, in the 1750s and 60s, whose great film with Jeremy Irons and whoever else it was, Robert De Niro. What was the name of that movie?
Mission.
Yes, The Mission. For more than a century, those deliberate, intentional commons had existed in what is now Paraguay and Buenos Aires, the great centers of Latin American anarchism. In the part of the world that I come from, the Great Lakes of North America, the people, the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, have given to the world, or to my country in particular, but also to yours, if I'm speaking to Irish, the notion of confederation, because Lord Edward Fitzgerald traveled through the Great Lakes as a guest of the Haudenosaunee to Detroit, where he received a new name and was inducted into into their nation the name of Egnidal. And he went up to the Lake Superior, then down Mississippi. He also learned of the dish with one spoon, as Joseph Brant, the leader of the Iroquois, or the Shawnee, explained the land and the necessity of commoning. The English commons of land, I don't think I need to descant on much, other than to say that the private enclosure acts passed by the robbers of Parliament were more numerous in the 1790s and 1798 than ever before. And by the time that Despard was hanged in 1803, had trebled over the rate of 1798, the number of enclosure acts. This, as we all know from our elementary studies of the history of capitalism, was the basis of the proletariat, the expropriation from the land that preceded the exploitation in the factory. But what I wish to add and to assert here is my understanding that this era of history can no longer be seen as a period of the Industrial Revolution. For me, industry now will never be separated from that vision that Bentham had of incessant labor. Remember, the mill to grind villains honest and the idle industrious. So I think in that quill comes Spence's writings about the commons. As people in London and in the different ports, perhaps in Dublin, I don't know, perhaps in Belfast, certainly in the Northern Star, the sailors are bringing knowledge of commons from around the world, as well as with their brothers and sisters in the docklands, are making commons, which you look back upon and you see as criminality. For this is how that shared, direct exchange of subsistence products was viewed. But we historians must look at things, as my teacher Edward Thompson taught us, with a satanic light, and to see the criminality not from the viewpoint of the merchants and mercantile giants, but to see it from the human standpoint of starve or steal. And the production of customs, neighborhood customs, invisible otherwise to the authorities or to the West India interest. This also is a type of commons, I put to us. So these are some of the variety of forms of commons, of direct meeting of human subsistence needs. They are opposed by a quartet of enclosers. Bentham is one, the architect of the prison. In 1803, they didn't finance his panopticon anywhere, though many, like from Pentonville to Millbank, I don't know about Mountjoy, were inspired by some of his principles. Hello. Yes, the commoners of Tothill Fields in Westminster, the boys playing sport, put an end to his dreams of building a panopticon in that part of London. I've just been on to that, thanks to the archival work of the librarian at the Westminster school. Now it's boys and girls in London. She's been very helpful, explaining that Sir Francis Burdett had been thrown out of that school in the 1780s for smashing windows, and he was in solidarity with another boy who refused to snitch on some destruction of windows in what we would call a dormitory where the boys lived, and related these to the cricket which was played on what was a commons and was shared by the cows of St. Margaret's and St. James. And this struggle lasted until this area now known as Vincent Square, near Westminster Abbey and the Parliament and whatnot. Anyway, I've just been onto it recently, and suddenly my mind went to it. What I want to make of it is that the streets had been places of play, that the fields and the outside was a place of children, that it was a space. Nowadays people say public space, but I'm calling it a commons. There's a common space where men, women, and children shared many different activities. And of course, was always criminalized or became criminalized by authorities, private developers, improvers, and so on. Jeremy Bentham, Arthur Young, I mentioned as the second of the quartet of enclosers. The third one would be Thomas Malthus, who I heard Ian Bowl speak about and quote very eloquently last night at the Smock Alley Theater. Malthus, whose second edition was released the year Despard was suffered, who said that not all are welcome at nature's table, who began to develop laws of nature, just as Young had developed laws of political economy, or as Bentham would develop laws of industry. Or my fourth in the quartet of enclosers is Patrick Colquhoun, who just developed the law. He developed the police of the city and river of London and developed a vision of policing. So what I'm writing about, Patty, what I want to complete in the next few weeks, and I thank you very much for your help of listening to this at a provisional, stage of development and research, is I'm taking this quartet of enclosers, Young, Bentham, Malthus, and Colquhoun, as thinkers whose thought is with us still, who are capitalist entrepreneurs of the mind, but also of profit and of the wall, of the enclosing wall, against the commons. And so we historians have to turn those sources around, using that satanic light, to begin to investigate where and how commons existed at that time, so I can make credible the hypothesis that we must see the Industrial Revolution and its technological enclosing, atmosphere poisoning, body destroying capacities as a vast effort of privatization and proletarianization, which I believe it's now possible to talk about. People are wondering about it worldwide with the onslaught of neoliberalism. Yeah. You might also find in that quill in the roast that is submit into Coldbath Fields the writings of Arthur O'Connor, who earlier that year in 1798, in January, had written a book on the state of Ireland, which was so dangerous that he had to leave Dublin in fear of his life for France to work with the exiled revolutionaries there for Irish independence. On his way, he went through London and found friends there. But then south, as he made his way to the coast, he was arrested. He was able to get out of that. But he wrote that the Irish people were worse housed, worse clad, worse fed. He castigated British imperialism not only for its crimes in Ireland, but in every quarter of the globe. Pillaging, starving, slaughtering the unoffending inhabitants of the East Indies, lashing the wretches that have been doomed to slavery in the West Indies. But of course, in both places there was resistance from the various forms of commoners. Hello, Ian, welcome.
Peter.
Yes. Yeah. I'd mentioned the Westminster School. I'm done with that. And now we've got the quill. In his youth, Ian Bowl was quite the bowler, I understand, in the game of cricket. Yes. Anyway, so here's a discussion of national liberation. This is what I wanted to indicate. Just as there was this discussion of the commons, as people were thinking with experience in struggle and experience in commoning in the prisons. Now, how am I doing?
You're doing good.
All right.
You've got about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. I'll go slow.
Maybe make it 5. Make it 5.
All right. Okay. All right. Good. Well, yeah, we did the manifold of the commons, didn't we? They completely misunderstand the noble savage. You know that's a diversion. I don't need to go into that. Tahiti, what a lovely commons there by the mid-1790s. Alexander Humboldt, what a commons there he finds in Tenerife as he's setting out to develop his isotherms, for the world. In Bengal, of course, who's introducing the private property in Bengal but Lord Cornwallis, your friend and mine, who, by the way, he was the leader. Hello, welcome. Make yourself comfortable. And he had been the leader in the destruction of gleaning as recognized in common law in 1787. So here is quite a powerful figure, no? In the destruction of commoning in this part of the world, as well as in Bengal. I personally love Thomas Russell. I don't think I need to talk to you about the 1942 Handbook of Irish Folklore, though for me it was necessary to understand its listing of the 5 types of Irish commoning, and including pasturage and squatting, the potato patch and metal, do you say? Nettle. And not to mention the beach, the strand, the kelp, the seaweed, and my teacher said that the common is one of the bridges from the Jacobin and utopian communism to nature. This is an expression from Thomson, whose great regret through all his life was the failure of the romantics, of the English romantic poets, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Blake, Shelley, to meet fully with the English working class movement. But I think now its time has come. I think that meeting can take place. But we must no longer see it as an English working class movement. We see it as a world working class movement. Certainly it's possible for us to see it as an Atlantic working class movement. And as for the romantics, well, the kingdom of the worlds are yours, each heart self-governed, the vast family of love, raised from the common earth by common toil, enjoy the equal produce. That's Coleridge, 1795, before he turns. William Blake, the whole business of man is the arts and all things common. There, he's writing in 1826. Wordsworth, something there was holden up to view of a republic, where all stood thus far upon common ground, that were brothers all. Yeah, so the commons was on their mind, you see, but Wordsworth, for all his view that he was going to speak in a new language, did not know the language of pidgin, did not know the flash language, did not know the Irish language, that vast source of American slang. So there's these views of the commons from Blake and Wordsworth and Coleridge cannot totally be ours, in my view. That has not yet been hooked to the Guarani, the Haudenosaunee, the John Clare would be better, somebody from the commons. But this is all the literary side to it. This is the literary side. And here we are in... I'd like to go and do the philosophical side, the Thomsonian moment of 1803, the Marxist moment of 1803, when the Marxists think they can divide utopian socialism from scientific socialism. Scientific socialism is just historical materialism. And I said at the beginning of today's talk that I think I had us historians do small stories, and I've given you a few small stories, but also we must do a big story. And this was the source of my title, Danny, and my great gratitude to the comrades of Madrid and of Spain, whose struggle has brought me here and enabled me to come to you. My publishers, Traficantes de Sueños, I love their name. It's the Traffickers of Dreams. They translated Silvia Federici's fine book, The Caliban and the Witch. They translated the Magna Carta Manifesto, and they are movement publishers. They are activists first and great scholars second. Why was I going on about them? Because I think, as we search, as Anne Whelan told me this morning, Peter, can you find something other than capitalism for us? As we were driving out the South Wall, built by Captain William Bligh, in quite early on, anyway. And that, I think, is our job. That, I think, is our task, is to begin looking to the past. And certainly in Spain, this was made known to me. If we are privileged, us who have a job as a professor in the academic world, surely it's to start to teach to our students how to answer that question, how to find a new world. In Malaga, I'd look through the glass in the pavement down at a Phoenician wall, and then there's a Roman amphitheater, and on top of that, there's an Arab fortress, and over here there's a Christian cathedral, and then there's the roar and stink of traffic of bourgeois civilization. And I thought, what next? What next is what we are creating. We are creating this slowly, and we must do it from the ground, because the city is part of the commons. It's no longer just a fort, a port, or a court. It's no longer the place just... This is what Despard thought. His notion of revolution was to attack the tower, attack the bank, attack the palace. But we can't do that. We can't settle for that insurrection. We must have a commons that many, many commons that we are slowly building, so that we are thick on the ground, thick and unstoppable. And out of this, perhaps, we will find a future.